Sabine actually thought she'd managed to cancel my 70th birthday. She was sitting there in my kitchen, tapping away on her tablet, and said quite flatly, "We aren't financing this little circus act." My son Thomas stayed silent. I just finished my cold coffee and gave a small nod. Understood. What she didn't realize was that the restaurant she had just canceled had been mine for 10 years. And tomorrow morning, her phone was going to ring. "Loretta, we have to be smart. Throwing a big 75th bash in this economy is just irresponsible." My daughter-in-law Sabine set her tablet aside and looked at me as if I were a bad investment. We were sitting in the kitchen of the house I'd maintained alone since my husband passed, at least until Thomas and Sabine moved in 2 years ago. Thomas stared into his mug, saying nothing. He worked hard, but Sabine handled the budget. "I already called the Lakeview Grill and canceled the reservation," she added. I felt a sharp sting, but I didn't let it show. The Lakeview was my favorite spot. I'd already sent out the invitations to all my old friends. "This house needs a new roof, Loretta. We can't fund a circus for your friends," Sabine said with that patronizing edge in her voice. She assumed I was scraping by on a small social security check while they generously supported the house's upkeep with their salaries. I took a sip of my now cold coffee. I could have argued. I could have mentioned that I'd paid the deposit out of my own savings. But I just watched as Sabine smiled triumphantly, already sketching out notes for a kitchen remodel she wanted. She thought she had total control over the money and my life. "Understood," I said simply. It wasn't a surrender. It was a realization. Sabine looked almost disappointed that I hadn't cried. She had no clue I was already running through my calendar in my head. Thomas looked up briefly, a flicker of guilt in his eyes, but he stayed quiet when Sabine touched his arm. The power dynamic in the house seemed settled, at least in their minds. I stood up, calmly rinsed my cup, and dried it thoroughly. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, but I felt strangely light. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting day for the restaurant's management. Sabine thought it was over, but she had just knocked over the first domino herself. The next morning started with a restless energy. I was in the sunroom reading the paper when Sabine's phone shrieked in the hallway. I heard her heels clicking fast across the hardwood. "Yes, this is Sabine Miller." "What?" "Excuse me." Her voice went up an octave. I calmly turned the page. "Why was the refund denied? That was a $2,500 deposit." There was a long pause filled only by the muffled murmur of the voice on the other end. "The owner! What does the owner have to do with this? It's a standard cancellation." Sabine practically screamed. Thomas came running out of his home office looking frazzled. "What's going on, Sabine?" She ignored him, staring at her phone like it had bitten her. "They're saying the owner personally ordered that the Miller family doesn't get a cent back because the cancellation was unauthorized." She glared at me through the sunroom's glass door. Her face was a mask of fury and confusion. I folded the paper neatly and stepped into the hall. "Is there a problem?" I asked, politely. "The restaurant is refusing to give the money back," Sabine snapped. "They say the owner blocked it. Did you call them, Loretta? Did you go behind my back and tell them lies?" I shook my head. "I haven't spoken to anyone, Sabine. But maybe it's because the contract was in my name, not yours." Thomas rubbed his forehead. "Sabine, I told you we should have talked to Mom before you did anything." But Sabine wasn't having it. "This is theft. I'm driving down there to give this owner a piece of my mind." I gave a thin smile. "You can try, but the owner is rarely on site. They usually handle things through the holding company." Sabine paused. "How would you know that?" I just shrugged and went into the kitchen to put the kettle on. Sabine had no idea the owner she was so desperate to find was currently reaching for the Earl Grey. For the next few hours, the atmosphere in the house was toxic. Sabine was on the phone, constantly trying to reach the general manager at the Lakeview, but she kept getting the runaround. What she didn't know, I had bought the land and the building years ago, when it was on the brink of bankruptcy. It was a quiet investment I'd made, using an inheritance from my aunt and some savvy real estate moves. Neither Thomas nor Sabine knew that I was LM Properties and Holdings. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. It was time to review the maintenance fee Thomas and Sabine transferred to my account every month. They viewed it as a sort of rent, but in reality, it barely covered the utilities for their high-maintenance lifestyle. They occupied the entire second floor, used my garage, and expected me to handle the landscaping. I looked at the electric bill. Sabine's new AC unit was sucking up a fortune. Until now, I'd ignored it for the sake of peace. But if she was going to call my birthday a circus, it was time for a reality check. I drafted a short document, a breakdown of actual operating costs, prorated by square footage. It wasn't an eviction notice. It was just a business correction. I was going to present them with a very professional invoice. At dinner, there was total silence. Sabine stared at her plate. That $2,500 was clearly missing from her kitchen remodel budget. "I'm going to see a lawyer tomorrow," she finally said defiantly. I placed the envelope with the cost breakdown next to her plate. "Before you do that, you should look at this. Utility and energy costs have spiked. Since you have exclusive use of the upper floor, we need to adjust the split." Sabine ripped the envelope open and her eyes went wide. The numbers on that paper were her first lesson in independence. "This is almost triple what we've been paying," Sabine yelled. She clutched the paper like she wanted to crumple it. Thomas took it from her and read it in silence. He was an accountant. He knew immediately the math was solid. "Mom, this is very precise," he said softly. I nodded. I thought we all wanted to be realistic, like Sabine said yesterday. Maintaining a large estate is expensive. We can't afford a circus, right? Sabine snorted. "You're only doing this because of the party. This is blackmail." I stayed calm. "No, Sabine. This is accountability. You wanted to manage the finances because you thought I couldn't. Now I'm showing you the real numbers. If you want to live here like it's an apartment, these are the market rates." I stood up. "By the way, I've taken back the key to the basement room you've been using for storage. I need the space for my files." Sabine jumped up. "You did what my winter clothes and Thomas's gym gear are in there." "They're currently sitting in the upstairs hallway," I replied matter-of-factly. "My house, my layout. You have your area, I have mine." It was the first time I'd drawn such a hard line. Before everything had just bled together, which led to Sabine acting like the lady of the manor while I was just a tolerated guest. That night I heard them arguing upstairs. Thomas's voice was muffled, Sabine's was loud and shrill. She didn't understand how the tables had turned so fast. She still thought this was about hurt feelings. She didn't realize I wasn't hurt, I was just finished being generous. The next morning, I found a note by the coffee maker. "We need to talk. Seriously." I smiled. Talking was fine, but action was better. The boundaries were set, and Sabine was realizing her territory was shrinking. 2 days later, Sabine decided to go to the restaurant in person. She forced Thomas to go with her. What they didn't know, I was already there. I was sitting in the small office behind the reception desk, talking to Mr. Hayes, the manager. "Mrs. Miller, I'm sorry about the unpleasantness with your family," he said respectfully. "Don't worry about it, Mr. Hayes. When a woman named Sabine Miller shows up, just explain that the lease for these premises contains a clause that only allows cancellations by the primary contract holder. Shortly after I saw them on the security monitor, Sabine stormed in, Thomas trudging behind her with his head down. She marched up to the front desk. I turned up the audio. "I want to speak to the owner. Right now," she demanded. Mr. Hayes remained perfectly professional. "The owner is unavailable. As I told you on the phone, the deposit is non-refundable as the cancellation was unauthorized." "I'm the daughter-in-law," Sabine shouted. "That is family money." Mr. Hayes corrected her gently. "The funds came from an account held by Loretta Miller. You do not have power of attorney." Sabine was livid. Loretta doesn't know the first thing about contracts. She's an old woman. At that moment, I stepped out of the office into the hallway right behind Sabine. "That old woman is standing right here, Sabine," I said quietly. She spun around, her face turning beet red and then ghostly pale. Thomas looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "Loretta, what are you doing here?" Sabine stammered. "I'm finalizing my birthday plans," I answered. "Mr. Hayes just confirmed that everything is on track. My circus is happening. But don't worry, you won't have to finance it. I've decided to trim the guest list." Sabine stared at me, unable to grasp why the manager was treating me like royalty. The mask of control finally shattered, revealing nothing but pure shock underneath. The drive home must have been hell for both of them. When I walked in an hour later, they were sitting at the kitchen table. No tablet, no notes, just two blank faces. "Mom," Thomas began. "Mr. Hayes, he was so respectful to you." "Why?" I sat down across from them. "Because I've been collecting the rent for his restaurant for 10 years, Thomas. And the rent for the office building your firm leases, for that matter." The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Sabine opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her entire plan to paint me as a helpless widow, to seize control of the house and my assets, crumbled into 1,000 pieces. "You're rich," she finally whispered. "I'm independent," I corrected her. "And I was happy to support you both as long as I felt it was appreciated. But trying to boss me around in my own home was a mistake. We just wanted to make sure you were taken care of in your old age." Thomas tried a weak defense. I looked at him hard. "By cutting off my social life and dictating how I spend my money, Thomas, I raised you better than that. You let Sabine dictate the rules in this house when not a single brick here belongs to her." Sabine started to cry, not real tears, but the angry tears of someone caught cheating. "What's going to happen to us?" Sabine sobbed. I took a deep breath. "The utility increase stays. The basement room stays my office. And as for my birthday, the reservation is confirmed. But I've instructed Mr. Hayes to remove your names from the list. If my party is a circus, I want to spare you the embarrassment of attending." Sabine looked up, and the panic in her eyes was finally real. They thought I was the prey, but they were realizing they were just guests on probation. Over the next few days, the climate in the house shifted radically. Sabine suddenly tried being nice. She cooked dinner, cleaned the hallway, and kept asking if I needed help in the garden. I remained distant. I'd had the locks changed on my private quarters on the first floor, not by a company but by myself, with new cylinders from Home Depot. My father had taught me how to be handy. One afternoon, Thomas came to me looking exhausted. "Sabine is afraid you're going to kick us out, Mom." I looked up from my roses. Why would I do that? As long as you pay your share and respect my privacy, the house is big enough. But the hotel mom days are over. You're adults. If Sabine wants a new kitchen, she needs to save for it instead of planning to use my money. Thomas nodded slowly. He almost seemed relieved someone had finally stood up to her. But Sabine couldn't help herself. She went through my files while I was out grocery shopping. She wanted to know exactly what the holding company was worth. What she didn't know was that I'd tucked a small camera on the bookshelf that streamed directly to my phone. I watched from the supermarket aisle as she desperately tried to pry open my locked desk drawer. It was sad to see how greed had eaten away at her character. When I got back, I didn't mention it at first. I just set down the bags and said, "Sabine, I noticed you're very interested in my bookkeeping. Next time you have a question, just ask. Pry marks on a mahogany desk are so unsightly in a nice home." She froze mid-step. The psychological pressure was working. She realized I was always one step ahead. Sabine was learning the hard way that transparency goes both ways. My 70th birthday approached. The preparations at the Lakeview were complete. I had invited old friends from all over the country, people who had known me for decades and who had loved my husband. Thomas and Sabine, meanwhile, sat upstairs in their apartment. They were isolated. No invitation, no information. Sabine had even tried calling my friends to badmouth the party, but no one listened to her. The evening before the party, I called them downstairs. "Tomorrow is the big day," I said. "I'm checking into a spa resort on the lake for 3 days to get ready. In the meantime, a security firm will be guarding the first floor. I don't want any accidental snooping in my files while I'm gone." Sabine looked like she was going to explode. "You don't even trust us in your own house. Trust is earned, Sabine. You tried to sabotage my celebration and essentially embezzle my money. Why would I trust you?" I looked at Thomas. "I'm sorry for you, son, but you chose to stay silent when she insulted me. Silence is a form of agreement." Thomas lowered his head. He knew I was right. He had taken the path of least resistance, and now he was paying the price. I grabbed my suitcase and headed for the door. A black car from the security firm was already idling in the driveway. A polite but firm-looking man stepped out. "Mrs. Miller, we'll take it from here." I nodded and handed him the key to the first-floor alarm system. Sabine stared through the window. Her world of control had officially collapsed. She was now just a tenant in a house she had almost claimed as her own. The circus was starting, but the clowns had to watch from the sidelines. The party at the Lakeview was wonderful. The sun glittered off the water, the wine was excellent, and the laughter of my friends filled the room. No one asked about Thomas or Sabine. We talked about old times, travels, and plans for the future. I hadn't felt this alive in years. I wasn't the widow or the mother-in-law. I was Loretta, a woman with her own life and her own success. During the main course, I gave a short toast. Some say that when you get older, you should step back and leave the field to the younger generation. I began. A soft chuckle went around the room. "I've learned that the field is only as big as you make it. Thank you for being here to celebrate this circus with me." We clinked glasses. At that moment, the security guard sent a photo to my phone. Sabine was standing in the garden, staring angrily at the locked first-floor windows. I deleted the photo immediately. I wasn't going to poison the moment with her negativity. I danced until midnight. Later, lying in my hotel room, I felt a deep sense of peace. I hadn't done anything cruel. I hadn't sued anyone or ruined them. I had simply stopped making myself small so that others could feel big. It was the best gift I could have given myself. The next morning, I got a text from Thomas, "Happy birthday, Mom. We've been thinking. We're going to look for our own apartment. It's probably for the best." I read it twice. It was the first adult decision he'd made in a long time. I didn't reply right away. I just enjoyed my breakfast overlooking the lake. Freedom tasted better than any birthday cake. Sometimes you have to lock the doors tight so others learn how to open their own. 3 months later, the upstairs was empty. Thomas and Sabine had moved into a modern rental in the city. The rent was high, and Sabine had to give up her dream of a luxury kitchen, but that wasn't my problem anymore. We saw each other once a month for coffee at a neutral cafe, not at my house. The relationship was polite, but distant. The old intimacy was gone, but the respect had returned. I renovated the house. The second floor was now a bright studio and a guest room for friends. The roof, which Sabine had used as an excuse to save, was actually replaced by a crew I paid in cash. I enjoyed the quiet of the garden and the fact that I no longer needed permission to live my own life. Sabine still tried to bring up my will occasionally, but I'd just changed the subject to the weather. On a sunny Tuesday morning, I was back at the Lakeview. Mr. Hayes brought me my coffee. "Mrs. Miller, we have an inquiry for a large wedding next year. The client asked if the owner might consider a discount." I smiled and took a sip. "Tell them, Mr. Hayes, that quality has a price. And tell them we don't do circus acts. Here we do real celebrations." He laughed and nodded. I looked out at the lake. My life was in order. My finances were secure, and my boundaries were ironclad. I wasn't the lonely old woman they wanted me to be. I was the director of my own fate. And as I felt the sun on my face, I knew the best part of the story was just beginning. No drama, just a very clear sense of self. Freedom begins the moment you stop apologizing for your own existence.